much for inviting me, and thank you everybody for being here. This has been a really inspiring time for me. And I must say that if some of you have read my pre-paper, it's going to be different what I will present, because I would focus only on one aspect of what I presented, and you can read it up, what I wrote about in the paper. I would like to focus on the biggest museum in Poland, which was opened in March 2017. It's located in Gdańsk, and it's a museum of World War II, as you can see. And I think that in the context of defining nation, but first of all in context of how the symbolic capital of a country is transferred into the political capital and the political legacy, this is a really significant example of the kind of messages that are being created, but also in terms of two visions of nation and two visions of the attitude towards the past that I'm going to present now. What you can see here is the logo of the museum, and also the photograph, which summarizes one of the points. It says, "Museum is for citizens, not for the politicians." And this was one of the slogans used during the manifestations that took place after the museum was opened. I will briefly tell you about some facts and figures about it. This is the museum. This is supposed to be the national monument. That's what it looks like. And the very short story of the museum is that it was designed, and the establishing documents were done by Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, nearly 10 years ago. And he himself comes from Gdańsk, so he was thought to be the real, co-author of the museum. And it took nearly 10 years for the museum to be finished. In the meantime, the government in Poland changed. So now, 2 weeks after the museum was opened in March, the idea was that the government tried to do something to take total control over the museum. And what happened was that it could not close the museum, so it created another museum in Gdańsk and made the decision to combine two museums into a new institution. And this is how they could have a new director and start building a new story around the museum. So everything happened in the year 2017. And my argument is that the new museology is being created, and it's a kind of national museology around the Museum of the Second World War. And we need to remember that the Second World War is the kind of most important, probably, symbolic capital for the Polish identity. So how it's consumed and how it's developed is really crucial for Polish identity. Just a very quick note about new museology. In the very famous riots in Paris that led to the collapse of General de Gaulle's government, there was a very interesting movement that started with the need of the citizens to share the heritage. So one of the ideas was that the state had no longer single authority to control the interpretation over the past, and that citizens could share the interpretation over heritage. This movement started to be called New Museology, and it can be also called democratic, inclusive museology. Today it is considered to be a part of Europeanization process of heritage. And this is where a number of European ideas actually get conceptualized, and we may have a look at democratization as the most important of Europeanization of heritage. In this respect, we don't actually look at museums as at sort of ivory towers that only sacralize the past and safeguard the past, but they are in fact considered to be some kind of identity institutions. So they are not static safeguarding places, but rather places of dynamic reinterpretation of the past. It is also possible to apply a concept of civilizing tool to the museum. So museums would be the institutions that actually introduce the ways of institutionalizing and civilizing, bringing Europe to the discourse of public memory. And the central idea for the Europeanization of heritage would be the concept of a person. The photograph that you can see here is the founding father of the museum, and I'm going to Donald Tusk. And now I just very briefly, I would like to present a short framework consisting of 7 elements that allow us to analyze museums. One of the problems when you analyze museums is that there is so much to look at. Yeah? There's so many narratives, there is the part of the experience, there's visitors' experience, there is the expectations of clients, there is so much, and it's very difficult to focus only, honestly, on the narratives. And then why would we focus only on the narratives? So what we're trying to do in that approach, we're trying to focus on several European qualities and try to defend the concept of Europeanization. But before I go on, I would like to present you 2 main critiques of the current right-wing government towards the exhibition. And those 2 main critiques basically show the axis of the whole conflict. One is that the history that is told in the museum does not represent Polish state viewpoint. Yeah? Which means, in open way, that the museum is thought to be a tool for making historical policy. Because in the word of Minister of Culture, Professor Gliński and Jarosław Kaczyński, museums are there to represent Polish viewpoint, not to reproduce the past or share the past or give the past to be interpreted, whatever. They are to represent the Polish viewpoint. Yeah? And the critics is that when Polish history gets contextualized and gets shown as one of the stories, it's for the bad of the Polish business, of Polish businesses. Actually, Polish viewpoint is something that needs to be stated. The second thing that Law and Justice government doesn't like in the newly opened exhibition is that the presence of military symbol is too small, and that there should be more military and more church in the exhibition instead of civilian people who are overrepresented according to Law and Justice. Yeah? So, on one hand, you have very strict vision of history, which is some kind of monolithic belonging to nation as an entirety. On the other hand, you have the inclusive vision of history, which is done, which is operated, authored by the people. And this is basically also not only the vision of the past, but also the vision of thinking about the society and of the attitude towards the past. So, what might we look at if you would like to see the kind of basic questions that we ask when we research the exhibition? How much time do I have, excuse me?
I'll tell you. Sorry.
Got lost.
Just a minute. 5 minutes and 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So the first figure is progress. In neoliberal discourse, history makes sense because it leads towards something. Okay, it has sense our actions have sense because they are directed to the future. Okay? And this is basically the kind of vision of history presented originally by the World War II Museum. There is a kind of flow of history, written as history, but war disrupted it, and then it came back to the normal linearity. This is the story told by the authors of the museum originally. Whereas what I find the main model of time presented by Law and Justice now is actually the mythological time. There is no linearity. There is the rule of prefiguration. What it means? It means that some events are presented in order to precede some other events. For example, some of the war events are presented as those who anticipated the plane catastrophe of Smolensk. I mean, it's funny to some extent, but the point is that what I find fascinating is that the linearity of times gets denied in the new version. Okay? The second quality is that there's always a need to ask a question, what are the museums used for? Okay? And the original version of the museum is that museums are public spaces and they are used to strengthen citizenship. They are the places where people actually have to exercise their citizenship and discuss it, problematize it. Okay? As I said, the new version of the museum would be to be a tool of representing Poland in the context of the world and to present Poland's only viewpoint. The third issue that we would look at in the analysis is dignity. So, for example, the question is, who are the heroes? Yeah? Would we name every sort of so-called average people? Would we allow them to have their own names? Yeah? Or would we rather talk about big institutions, just like the new version of the changing scenario for the new exhibition is doing? Yeah? We would rather talk about institutions such as church, nation, state, not about the individual people. Finally, the next one is the issue of diversity. The question is, how many different heritages can we actually include in the discourse of the war, in this case? Okay? Would you focus on the official discourse of the politics, of the history, of the military, or would you rather include all the minority narratives, not necessarily representing the good Polish viewpoint, the good Polish business? Yeah? Would you include private heritages? Would you include all the minority stories, all the private heritages, or not? Obviously, the more monolithic history is presented, the easier to control it. The next one is inclusion, is also the question, who gets included in the process of interpretation of the past? Okay? Can we include visitors? Can we ask them to have their own word, to have their own sentence, to have their own saying, or not? But it's also the question of including private heritages, such as you can see. This is something, 2 minutes, okay? There are two more issues, narrativity. So how the storytelling is done. Is it one-way storytelling or would it be plurivocal? And finally, we ask a question about governance, so about democratic governance, what kind of word is reflected in the exhibition and what kind of control over the final message of the exhibition is given. So, trying to conclude, there are two visions of state and the past that collide in the museum, with nation as a central concept. Of course, I would support what has been said during that seminar already. So, and obviously those are very simplified, but you can very easily find them in the discourse and in the public debates about the museum. On one hand, you've got the monolithic nation that is victimized and that had to suffer in order to work for its future capital, to be Poland, and it's monolithic. On the other hand, you've got diverse nation of various individuals and people. On one hand, you've got nation as a community of people and groups. On the other hand, you've got nation as a community of institutions, such as church. The late critique for the museum was that the church's role was not highlighted enough, although the individual priests were present there. And finally, as compared to what you told us yesterday, Deborah, there is an opposition between the nation as community of blood and ancestors, to whom we should give respect, and the state, the nation, as a kind of civil state. Yeah, if you take the first letters of those elements for the analysis, what comes up as an acronym is a pudding, really. So that's why, I mean, I like it because it's very easy to memorize. So you could really exercise it as a European pudding kind of thing. And it is very powerful if you operationalize it when you are in the museum for the fieldwork. Final conclusions. What I'm trying to present is a kind of concept of national museology, which would be seen as a way of transferring symbolic capital, identity capital, into the political capital. We obviously know that any power needs the past to be legalized, but the museums, and this museum, is actually the case where this is happening, yeah? Where the symbolic identity capital is in straight transmission for the legalizing of the current government. The second thing, and we don't have time for that, is a matter of democratization, what it means in Europe, to what extent it's European, to what extent it's global, but anyway, inclusive heritage and dynamic heritage can be seen as a kind of, as a phase of Europeanization process. And finally, what is my favorite, but also most dangerous point, is that the figure of truth and figure of representation of the past is actually subsidized now, being subsidized with very strict mythological structures, which are not used for any reproduction of the past, but in fact for the storytelling, which has a very obvious political sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Good, Agnieszka now.
I think very much in line with what Łucja was saying, I will be looking at a reportage or a work of non-fiction by Marcin Kącki, a fairly well-known young reporter, investigative reporter, who has uncovered different sorts of scandals or sort of hidden links between different power holders. He was nominated to the Nike Literary Award for this book, which was published in 2015. And the title is quite significant. It's called Białystok, Biała Siła, Czarna Pamięć, which means white power, black memory. Białystok, the name Biały is white. It is connected with the name of a river nearby. However, the white power and black memory already suggests that we will be talking about sort of intertwining memories of the past and rather gruesome present of the growing nationalist, radical nationalist movement. So Białystok is a city in the Podlaskie region. I mean, this is just some very general information. So what is important is that it was one of the places where the Jewish minority was actually almost a majority in the city. Now, the national or ethnic identity claimed by the inhabitants in the 2011 census is around 94% Polish, hardly other, and then the religious denomination is over 80% Roman Catholic. However, in 1936, 43% of the inhabitants were Jewish. So there is a huge reshifting of the sort of structure of the city. What is also significant is that the Jewish cultural life in Białystok was very vibrant. There were lots of cinemas, theaters, institutions, and the pre-war urban elite was in a large part composed of Jews. So what I wanted to show based on the analysis of this reportage is how there is an absence of this Jewish past, which is somewhat deliberate, and a sort of filling of the gap by a new sort of ideology of the nationalist groups, as well as new interpretations of the past by the current government. So the different forms of the Jewish absences, for instance, are a sort of forgetting of the Jewish past. There is a concept of folder-like multiculturalism, which Podlasie promotes itself with, that shows a multicultural past, but in a very superficial and somewhat embellished way, in which there is a mention of the minorities, but not really representing the fact that it was actually a fairly, Jewish city, if you think about it. So a sociologist, whose research is also mentioned in the book, who conducted a survey with the current inhabitants of Białystok, finds that only 7% of the Białystok residents, when asked about the World War II, actually mentioned the Holocaust. Only more than 5% find that helping Jews during the war is something to be proud of. Jews are considered to be a sort of long-lost minority, deserving kind of a side note in the history of the town. There is an instance in which the reporter also comments on how the city on its official website portrays the history of the city, in which exactly the Jewish minority is just presented somewhere as, well, there were some Jews and there were some cultural organizations, fine, but definitely not as a sort of central current in the culture of the city. So that creates a sort of a problematic identity and problematic understanding of a history, which Konski calls a history without the menorah and the mezuzah, and a sort of a refusal to acknowledge its Jewish past by the current inhabitants. And of course, I'm giving here different examples, focusing on sort of this negative aspect, the difficult moments of the past, while Konski also shows the activists or the local cultural actors, let's say, who try to revive that past. So, probably the most kind of metaphoric, like the best metaphor of this forgetting is the case of the old Jewish cemetery called Rabbinical Cemetery, which was destroyed during the liquidation of the Białystok ghetto. And in communist times, soon after the war, it was basically destroyed in rubble. And it was, there was a park constructed on the place of the cemetery. So Konski finds his way to the city architect, who is now in his 90s, who comments on this moment. So to quote, he says, "It was 1954, only rubble, some goats and drunkards were shitting on these matzevas, nobody would guard it. I felt sorry for the cemetery, I'm telling you honestly, and nobody thought of unearthing or moving it. So I came up with the idea to bury it, simply as it is." And then after a moment, he admits, "We all felt it should have been done differently." Now the park still exists. There is a monument there that has been erected in 1975, which says, "Tribute to the heroes of the Białostockie lands fallen in the struggle for a people's Poland." So you can imagine a very sort of communist message In 2007, interestingly, in a sort of illegal procedure, some local patriots have added a Bóg honor ojczyzna, God honor of homeland inscription, which after some legal battles have actually been kept. So if you look at this particular place or site that has been a burial site for centuries, that contains the remains of the Jews buried there before the war, and also the ones that perished during the war, among them the Jews that were burnt alive in the Białystok synagogue. You see also that there are several layers that sort of come above this initial cemetery. There is a layer of the socialist war narrative, and then a layer of a sort of Catholic nationalist interpretation of history. These are the pictures actually of the park now and when it was still a cemetery. And a similar sort of omission or sort of forgetting in terms of a monument, in terms of marking the space, is the monument to the children that were thrown out of the trains that were going to Treblinka death camp. So it was a sort of last desperate moment to actually save the children by hoping that if they are thrown out of the train, somebody will find them and take care of them. Unfortunately, this town of Łapy, which is near Białystok, was where the train was slowing down, and the German soldiers figured that this is happening, and most of the children did not survive. So in 1968, a monument was erected, which strangely was sponsored by the Scouts Association, and it says, "From Scouts to the heroic Polish children." Nobody really knows that it is connected with the history of the Holocaust. How this monument entered the local politics is that when a proposal of a new monument that was to be erected by a Jewish family to the people who saved them, their ancestors during the Holocaust, the right-wing local council, as Konsky explains, did not agree, arguing that a monument for one Jewish family is too much, and reminded that there already is a monument devoted to the children who died tragically. Unfortunately, nobody mentions that they were Jewish children. Perhaps the most kind of shocking element is the case of Jedwabna, the case where of the town fairly close to Białystok, where the local inhabitants, Jewish inhabitants, were murdered by their Polish neighbors put into a barn and burned. You may have heard about it. So Konsky goes to the town and interviews the current inhabitants, who don't really want to acknowledge the responsibility of the previous inhabitants, sometimes their parents or grandparents, for what happened. The kebab shop owner says, it was the war, different things happened during the war, and then he adds, anyway, he doesn't like history, he always preferred scientific subjects. A young woman says, I don't know what to think about it. You read one thing on the internet and you hear another. The old people know better. We live in the present. So, and again, this kind of complete removal of the past from the current understanding of the events. And what these absences also say is that there is a space that can be sort of used in which a completely different presence can be affirmed. So Białystok became well known for the presence of the radical right groups, which even kind of appropriated this the white power symbols. So they even say white power in the white city. So welcome to the capital of the white power. They have their anti-Semitic views, but also they have different targets which they address, the LGBT community, different types of foreigners, Lithuanians who are always there in this region, but also the newcomers, Chechen family, a mixed family, and so on. They have such lovely slogans as "I will not apologize for Jedwabne," "All Poland only white," "Poland only for whites," "Nationalism is our weapon." They mark their territory by, of course, painting all these graffiti and slogans. What is perhaps a link to what Louis was telling us before is that you can see that they are inspired by different sort of transnational movements, xenophobic movements. So there was even a graffiti that was in English, inspired by an American neo-Nazi. There was also a group of teenage fascists, which were actually, investigated, who covered the city with all sorts of Nazi and anti-Semitic symbols. These young boys, who were between 13 and 18 years old, openly sort of admitted to being fascist, to hating Jews. They had some drawings of swastikas in their school notebooks. Of course, nobody noticed, the parents didn't realize, and so on and so on. But what is interesting here is that even though they display this kind of very typical neo-Nazi views, they also have a certain conviction that the Jews are ruling the world, so this kind of world conspiracy. So one of the boys says that he dislikes Jews for history, for blaming Poles for the Holocaust, for their high notion of themselves, for being in the elites, for wanting to rule our country. Which by Bilevich, for instance, and other theorists of prejudices is called secondary anti-Semitism. I believe that the Jews are responsible for the anti-Semitism that targets them. So some lovely pictures of the radical movement in Białystok. The fourth one on the bottom says "Nationalism to wolność," nationalism is freedom. I think very interesting statement for our seminar here. And finally, what the reportage reveals, it's also kind of an investigation into the links that are between these radical movements in the city and the football club, Jagiellonia Białystok, which is in turn connected with the sort of criminal underground of Białystok, but is somehow accepted or tolerated by the local institutions. There were famous issues of courts delivering very sort of lenient sentences to people who, for instance, drew swastikas and so on. What is also interesting, I think, in the light of what we were discussing earlier about patriotism and nationalism, is that the radical movements kind of appropriate the patriotism. So they say, we are the ones who are patriots, we are the ones who are proud, we don't want to be shamed for what we believe in. So because of this kind of merging of patriotism and nationalism, patriotism as supposedly more positive term becomes kind of connected with the kind of worst kind of radical or nationalist views. And finishing, another sort of way of constructing sort of new visions of the past and new heroes is this idea of celebrating the so-called cursed soldiers. There's even an exhibition, photo exhibition in front of the church here, as far as I saw, These were the soldiers that were in the home army, but decided to continue their fight in the communist state. So now they are considered by this government as sort of anti-communist heroes. However, a lot of them have also a very problematic past, since they were targeting Jews, they were targeting other minorities, they were, for instance, targeting Orthodox families who they were accusing of collaborating with the communists and so on. So Jarosław Kaczyński, announcing that he will open a museum of the cursed soldiers, said, "Those who were fighting for freedom were depicted earlier as bandits. Those who enslaved the Polish nation were presented as defenders of the good, sometimes as heroes." So you can see a complete sort of shifting. So the cursed soldiers are central to this new Polish right-wing politics of memory, and their appearance is simultaneous with the disappearance, wiping out of the Jewish history in Poland, especially when it comes to denying Polish responsibility in pogroms and anti-Semitic attacks, and focusing only on Polish marginality. So the sociologist that Konski is also talking with realizes that, quote, "If we do not finish our collective examination of conscience, aggression, lack of tolerance, prejudices about different groups of people, not only Jews, will intensify." And indeed, this is what seems to be happening, because the sort of anti-Semitic violence, both physical and symbolic, is also a kind of a template for other forms of prejudice, and especially in the recent time, the anti-Muslim prejudice. This has also been noticed by scholars that deal with prejudices, how anti-Semitism provides a psychological basis for other forms of prejudice. What is interesting, I think, is, for instance, how Andrzej Leder is the last slide. How Andrzej Leder interprets this kind of forgetting of certain elements of the past, is that after the sort of traumatic events of the Second World War and the communist times, there is a new middle class which forgets the past and focuses on the future to build a new symbolic imaginary. So the past becomes mythologized or phantasmatic, and the hegemonic middle class still lives to some extent in a dream. So this kind of strategic forgetting and remembrance of only selected events seems to be very much central to our experience today. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, now it's time for questions and comments, please. Yes, Uroš?
So, first of all, thanks to both Lucia and Agnieszka. It was great. It was, unlike many of us, very concrete, with a real case study. So, I have one very quick and one less quick question for Agnieszka. First is Ojczyna. Is Ojczyna homeland or fatherland?
Ojczyzna is fatherland, in fact. That's
good,
yeah.
And then the real question now comes. It's reminded me a lot about how the Jews and the remembrance of Jewish sufferance was treated also in some Serbian cities, smaller Serbian cities. Not necessarily Belgrade, but for example Novi Sad. So my question is, you are writing about strategic remembering and forgetting. We heard a lot about strategic forgetting, but a bit less about strategic remembering. So can you give us some more examples, especially when the very same people tend to forget and remember? And this is the first, and maybe another sub-question would be, you're speaking about strategic remembering. Analyzing the Serbian case, it's very often strategic exaggerating, even strategic inventing. Do you have these two, or you just satisfy yourselves with strategic remembering and commemorating and self-organization and martyrology, as you said? Thanks.
Should I respond now? Or should I collect
let's take at least one more. Yeah?
I have one question for you. as I understood, you said that this inhabitation of the exhibition in the museum proposed by Peace is much more ideological than the other one. But following Max Weber thought, every kind of exhibition has this aspect, but the value is different, right? You present. So is it really less objective? Do you think so? I have a question also for you. I mean, I understand what you say, like the proposal to change attitude to collective memory, but if you ask the question why actually people should remember Jews in Poland, they have no interest. And actually after the transition, there was no systematic new policy of collective memory by previous governments, which would change anything. They just were passive, I would say. And now the government which is more active in this field, because they have very focused on historical policy. So this so-called normal people have no interest in remember someone who is not their group, right? Member of the group. So if you ask the question why we don't remember, maybe the answer is a mechanism which produces such remembrance, right? We know that this very often comes from some institutions, a policy who sponsor this, and yet that is the best case of this process. And the other question, there are lots of cities like this in Poland. What is special about Białystok, where there was Jewish majority, they disappeared, and now in different degree people remember them or not.
Okay. If there are no more questions at the time, let's hear your answer.
Should I answer first?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, strategic remembering. So on the one hand, this very new category of cursed soldiers, it hasn't really been discussed earlier. So that's one of the instances, but also a very selective approach to remembering the Polish-Jewish relations. So focusing on, of course, more positive sides rather than acknowledging the responsibility for anti-Semitism. I mean, it has been done by the sort of intellectual or academic elites, but it is still not really acknowledged in a wider way. I mean, this government was, for instance, thinking of introducing a law that doesn't allow to, how can you say, to smear the Polish nation. So if you criticize the Polish nation or accuse the Polish nation of something, you may be subject to some kind of punishment. So, and when it comes to exaggerating or inventing, of course, there would be instances of it. So, exaggerating, you know, the Polish suffering as opposed to Jewish suffering, for instance, is a very sort of typical example. Inventions, well, we can talk about inventions. Why should Polish people remember the Jewish past? Well, the idea is that if you don't come to terms with the past, with the negative...
The question is not normative, because I think you are kind of normative. Mine is not normative, so my question is rather, you know, outside this moral order. It's rather kind of, I don't want to say scientific question, but you know what I mean. What makes them remember? Or what would make them
What would make them remember?
In this sense, yeah? Yeah, you can change the grammar of the sentences.
Yeah, I guess it's about also a feeling that this was a joint past, right? Because if you remember the past only as communities, that, okay, it wasn't our community, so it's not our past, right? So if, for instance, in the public sphere, you have more elements that remind you that it was a, you know, past that was lived together, perhaps that would already change the perception to some extent. But they did to some extent as well. I mean, you know, to emphasize, for instance, that, you know, authors of the popular children stories were Jewish, right? Like Tuvim, or like, you know, to kind of make you realize that this is not a separate past, I would say. I don't know if I have an answer either.
So just say, maybe just the point is also that even in these accounts, in the interviews, the memory that is suppressed is really coming up, and this is also a problem. They do remember, very many of them. They don't want to articulate the memory. Of course, we can talk also about post-memory mechanisms, right? How do you dig this memory, not to transfer it, and so on. But if we look into the interviews from right after the war, during the active Wagner trials and so on, there is memory there, and it's just suppressed. And first of all, and then there was pressure also not to speak about it. So.
Yeah, exactly. If you look at Myzwi Jedwabnego, there was this reportage, kind of historical investigation, in which the author looks at the testimonies right after the war of the people who lived in Jedwabne or knew about what happened. They are, you know, and then if you compare what they say now, it's also a completely different story. So there is a memory, but it has been completely repressed. So, yeah. And what is special about Białystok? Well, of course, the fact that it was a fairly large city and a very multicultural city, if you want. But also because it is now considered as, I mean, it has been considered for some time as this less developed part of Poland. So this idea of shaming, perhaps, that was proposed by Professor Czapliński yesterday would be interesting, that somehow these are the margins of Poland, and somehow, you know, the feeling that you have to assert your presence even more is... would be an explanation, perhaps. You were, oh, sorry.
As to your comment, of course, I don't... Okay. Apparently, there are two different ideologies behind each vision. One ideology, I would say, would be more civil state-oriented, but in general, I don't really believe that museums are places for most of all, for objective presentation of the past. I would say that museums are rather spaces for intersubjectivity, which means, in consequence, that the crucial question is what is your attitude as a museum towards the visitors? Yeah? If you treat them as subjects who are capable of interpreting history, or you treat them as pupils for whom the story is told and there is no possibility to reinterpret it. And in those two different visions that shift, this is the biggest, I would say this is the very big difference, and it is ideological in both cases, because one talks about individuals that have the power to influence history, and this is the ideology of neoliberal ideology and so on. Yeah?
Isn't it rather a matter of the way the information is presented, not what kind of information is this?
I think it's both. I think what kind of informations are presented and also how they are presented, because the question is whether the visitors have the right to have their own point or they don't. And this is not only the matter of choosing facts and not only the matter of how, I think.
Yes.
So, you know, it's very, I was struck in your presentation. I just visited Budapest with my students and we went to the Museum of Terror. And I was in Vilnius last year and I went to the Museum of Terror. And now, from what I saw, it seems like the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk is becoming the Museum of Terror. There is this incredible similarity of the narrative and the images that I saw. The juxtaposition, almost equalizing of communism and Nazis and fascism, the terror. The way this is presented. And it almost seems like they all have the same architect, you know. It's unbelievable. I mean, of course they do because it's the same politicians, but maybe there is also like this, you know, maybe they like Orban makes a recommendation to Kaczynski, you know, take this guy, he's gonna do it right. So, so I just wanted to comment on that the narrative, it's not just Polish, this is really very similar to what's happening in these other countries, post-Soviet, of the post-Soviet bloc. I also want to say that I think I agree that you know there's always an ideology. Like you said, there's always an ideology in the museum. I think, however, it really, and I think that's why it matters so much what ideology it is, because if it's the ideology of larger, in which citizenship that is being produced in the museum, right? Or performed in the museum, produced also in the museum, because it's also active production of certain versions of citizenship. If that vision of citizenship, if that ideology is an ideology that is more inclusive than just that one nation, then it matters, right? So even though I think that, like, you know, Tusk's idea for the museum was also ideological. It matters what kind of ideology it was. It was an ideology that was trying to include other, you know, with the world in what the Second World War was. And now it's the museum of the Polish War, in which the World War is relatively not significant, right? So I think it really matters because that's the kind of citizenship that is being produced now in this museum. So I don't know. I just want to say I think it really matters. It really matters what kind of ideology is behind it. And I also wanted to say that that I think that in Białystok, because I've been in all of these places with my students and I've seen so many of them, you know. Białystok is special, I think, because of course I have no proof for this, but I think that the strength of the nationalists, of these white power movements, and the strength of these movements is especially strong in these territories that were so Jewish, and where the forgetting is so strong, and probably the trauma of the forgetting, because it runs through families. It's not just the official version, that it's not just what the government says. And the government, we know, I mean, except for a very short period of time, after 1990s, you know, 2000s, where there was some kind of an opening to the discussion of the Holocaust. We know that in general, after the war, until now, with this short little break, the official version was clear. But there is this other memory, right? Is this memory of the community, of your personal community, and I think it's kind of proportionate. So that kind of forgetting, active forgetting, is proportionate to the guilt and trauma of what these places are. And one last comment I want to say, it's not my idea, but because with my colleague we do a lot of Holocaust education with students by taking them to these places, and sometimes, you know, we get students who are for example, from the United States, who really have, you know, and increasingly so, a very skeptical view. I mean, they say things that are very deeply anti-Semitic. For example, I had a student this year coming up to me who said, so we will go to Austria from Budapest. He asked me, so are we going to speak about anything Austrian in Austria? And I said, why would you say that? And because in Budapest we only studied the Jews. And we didn't hear what the ethnic Hungarians think. And of course we did. We went to the Museum of Terror. It's all about it. You know, but who was the ethnic Hungarian? But I think that the challenge, you know, of that we are seeing now, there is something happening. So again, I'm getting back to the idea of why is this new? I think something is happening. Something is new, and it's not just coming from our countries here in which we live and from Central Europe. But these are students from the U.S. who come and they are questioning, you know. So I don't know what I wanted to say, but this is just comments. Sorry.
Right. We have Raoul, we have Deborah, and Maria.
Okay, thank you. It's actually onto what we were listening. So first, thank you both for very powerful and concrete case studies. My first question is for Lucia. Just a clarification of, I think you had sort of a typology where the first one was national museology, here it was official version of the statement history legitimized through this museum presentation. I wasn't clear how that was different from your third version, where symbolic capital of the past is used as political capital and capital with use of myths. So if you could just clarify those, how you, because to me those sounds like they really interact, but so I want clarification on that. And my second comment to you was really on this notion of democratization of heritage, and it follows up with what I understood some of what Hannah was saying. This democratization, especially given those two other types that you put forth, could sound like the preferred version of how to go about doing museology, but it depends, I think, very much on what the ideology is behind the democratization. If it's simply equal voices with no sort of principle of how we weigh the evidence of history, that could also be quite problematic. So that's my first comment to you. And Agnieszka, I know you ran out of time, but I was curious about your own sort of input into reading the text and also maybe positioning the author as well. It's a very powerful case study, but how do you analyze the contribution given who this author is, for example?
Thank you for two very, very interesting presentations. I've got a few just short, hopefully, easy to answer questions. First, in your presentation, Lucia, and I know you skipped over this because most of the Poles in the room know the story, but I don't, and I didn't quite get what's the current status of the museum, what happened to it, because it was advertising at some point under this slogan, "Come see it before they close it," and I found it interesting that the fact that they were expecting this to happen. So, what is going on now? Because it's changed, right? It's no longer the same kind of museum. It was okay. That would be the first question. The second is more of a comment, like progress. You mentioned is a neoliberal conception. Progress in history is a conception as old as modern history, right? It's the positivist conception. It's been challenged recently, but it's not neoliberal. It goes way back. And also, as a critical comment on that note, this notion of the Europeanization of heritage is also a very progress-oriented conception. It's getting out of the dark ages of nationalist interpretations of history to the light of European measures of heritage, but I don't see it this way. Now, Agnieszka, again, very concrete. Now I want to ask about the Smolensk thing. I find it fascinating. How are events of World War II prefiguring Smolensk? Can you give some examples, please? Agnieszka, memory laws. You mentioned that the Polish government is considering. What was the reaction to the Ukrainian ones? Because I suppose they would react to the Ukrainian ones considering they involved the murder of Poles. So what did the Polish government have to say about those? And are they in any way relating their own vision of memory laws to the Ukrainian? Second is also legislation. What's the current status of legislation on Holocaust denial and hate crimes in Poland? And does it exist? Does it exist, but it's not implemented? Are people charged but not found guilty? Are they not charged at all? Stuff like this. And a comment to both of you. Question actually. And it's also a question to Hannah and to my own work, and it links to Viaczeslav's presentation this morning. This singling out of Jews in the Holocaust, in the World War II Holocaust narrative, is problematic for some people because they see the two things as separate. And it was pretty clear in your presentation, Agnieszka, in the interviews, that people think this is World War II and this is the Holocaust, and they're two separate things. And we should not mix them. And I think to some extent we reproduce the same issue when we focus on the Holocaust as something distinct from mainstream Polish history or Romanian history or whatever. And would you think, in order to make this relevant, both of the American students who are wondering why are we focusing on the Jews in Budapest, is to integrate the history of the Jews and the history of the Holocaust better with mainstream majority history, not to treat the Jews as these minorities and so on and so on, and be so obsessive about including minority narratives, but linking the minority narratives to majority narratives and seeing the way in which the two
wasn't this Agnieszka's point that it needs to be integrated?
When? Because the point I got from her presentation was it was never really integrated. After the war, the two narratives just developed separately. You would have Holocaust memory probably outside Poland, and in Poland first the communists forgetting and then the post-communists forgetting treated the Jewish history. That's what I got, that it treated the Holocaust separate from World War II.
my question to the co-organizers. We're running 20 minutes late. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Can we go on? Fine.
Okay.
Fine. Okay. So you want to
I just wanted to
interject now?
So I think that the problem is that because of the silencing, that when you're teaching, because we don't teach specifically the Holocaust, we teach the identity of Central Europe. The objection is that we talk about the Jews at all. And so, but you are sort of, as a person who's trying to teach this kind of, more diverse type of history, and really, and that's what I forgot to finish with my story, because I forgot. But I was saying, my colleague, in response to what the student said, but it's like, this is, you cannot teach identity of Central Europe and historic identity of Central Europe without talking about the Jewish, about what happened here, about the Holocaust. So, we do that, but you are, in the position of bringing out things that are so deeply silenced. And just by bringing them out, you seem to be like, just focusing on the Holocaust, just by speaking about it. So if you say it, then you are suddenly, somebody who is focusing on the Holocaust too much, just by mentioning it. So that's what I want to say. I think that there is an effort, to bring the two together, but they. Anyway, okay.
What I have to comment, I think, actually follows up from what Hannah and Raoul have said, because I think this concept of terror is a very present one nowadays. I think there's a lot of terror, but there is a lot of terror happening all around us. And as far as the American students are concerned, I've just seen the 9/11 World Trade Center Memorial, and that's it's kind of very in the middle of New York, and it's very visible, and there's this kind of it looks like a rectangular pool with water running down from the edges, and there's all this. I perceive it as a very strong symbol of history that's ongoing, and we have to, this is terrible, and we have to make people aware that it happened, but on the other hand, we have to learn from it and move on from it and keep it always present, precisely because we need to make sure it doesn't happen again, or do what we can for it not to happen. So I guess all this at the same time, there is a lot of mentioning of the Holocaust all over the place nowadays, and the Holocaust studies seem to be much more present than they ever were. And I guess it is related to the fact that we are at the moment witnessing a lot of minority discrimination and a lot of terror. And in relation to that, I was thinking of this drive to spatializing memory. And of course, we've been talking about sets of memory for a very long time again. But then if I connect your two papers, which were wonderful, thank you very much. If you think of, on one hand, cities that used to be in one way and have changed. Cities and cemeteries, cities as cemeteries, right? So you visit a city that used to be totally different and from which a certain community, the Jewish one, has been eliminated, erased, as compared to museums that are about institutionalizing memory, in the sense about preserving memories. They're supposed to kind of conserve stuff and teach people something, but on the other hand, the narrative they tell is not the one that was intended, because sometimes they are built with a certain purpose in mind and they are used in different ways. So is this spatialization of memory a way of teaching the past in order to inform the present? Or is it more about a kind of nostalgia that's keeping, that's preventing progress? Yeah, you just started against, I think, progress in history. Progress in the sense of, in the ethical sense, I guess. That makes sense.
So perhaps we can have some short answers from you.
Short?
For these questions.
Because we're going to go on forever.
I know, we could go forever with that, I know. I'll try to be very brief then. To start, I'm sorry for not being clear enough, because I skipped several things, that's why it was not clear enough. The current state of museum, I start with that one because then it gives the situation. Now, you still have a chance to visit the museum in the shape which was designed by an ex-director and an ex-team. The director changed, and the exhibition will be probably changed soon. What I was trying to focus on with my research was not actually only the exhibition, but the debate over the museum, because it actually highlights the vision of the past, and it highlights what the vision of the national identity actually is, you know. And so this is basically the current state of museum. It is what is very important is that the museum is national. Yeah, it's not. It's ruled. It's financed by the government. So so the government thinks that because it's financed by the government, it should represent the proper Polish viewpoint, and it's interesting to see what the proper Polish viewpoint is in that sense. Yeah. In terms of progress, yeah, I skipped it because all the model that I tried to present comes from of course, the Enlightenment idea, and it fits well with some neoliberal issues, with some not. Democracy is one of those things. Dignity, equity, diversity, all of them are those ideas that actually are a kind of ideology, but also are a kind of framework to which we can relate by asking questions about the exhibition. One of the other concepts, which is also a post-Enlightenment one, which is so important here, is the concept that heritage needs to be something practical and is not self-explanatory any longer. So the past is not sacralized, and it's not enough. So the Europe says we need to use heritage. We need to make heritage something practical. For example, we would teach citizenship basing on the past. We would teach geography with the use of old maps, you know, and so on. So I think. While heritage is no longer self-explanatory and needs practical usage, this is also one of the phases of post-Enlightenment, you know, influence. Because we don't really have time for that, just to give you the answer about where the prefiguration of Smolensk is, because nobody would believe that it's true, because that's how absurd it sounds. As you know, all mythology gets actualized in public rituals, and this is what happened now on the 1st of September with the anniversary of the First World War. And the celebration was prepared by the scouts and by the city, because the president of Gdańsk didn't want to agree for the Ministry of Defense to take over the whole ceremony. And the scouts were supposed to be reading that list of all the heroes that were murdered there. While the government's idea was that in the list of all the heroes, you would start from the heroes of the Second World War, ending up with the president and with the heroes of the catastrophe. So this is sort of list of our heroes, and because in Poland the cult of ancestors is so strong, it is very important that we actually make a very clear storyline. That, you know, we all start with Black Czech Rus and you know, and the Battle of Grunwald, whatever, and then it all goes towards it, and the recurrency of the time model is very straight. I think this is it.
Okay. I'll try to be brief. What is the position of the author? So on the one hand, I chose this author because taking into consideration other works that of reportage, since this is the material that I deal with, they focus more on particular events. So for instance, Anna Bikon's on Jedwabne, then there is a reportage on 68 anti-Semitic campaign, which I would like to eventually incorporate. I think this book for a paper like this is a good material because it joins sort of the present instances of racism or anti-Semitism and this Jewish past. In fact, the author admits in an interview that he was motivated by the fact that Białystok has very high, let's say, police ratings on hate crimes. And I think this element of Jewish past kind of came later in his, when he was started to investigate. Also, he's a fairly young person and he's not Jewish. So he came from a position of an outsider to Białystok. Of course, now he's the public enemy. So yeah, very briefly. About Ukrainians, there's definitely a sort of competition in suffering or martyrology, and there are, well, it's a whole different topic maybe that wouldn't be addressed here. Let's keep it for later. Holocaust denial. There is a legislation in which you cannot use Nazi symbols. And of course, there are laws about hate crimes, racist crimes. However, for instance, when it comes to issues discussed in the book about attacks on sexual minorities, that is not present in the Polish law. So they can't complain about being...
Nothing like non-discrimination?
There is general non-discrimination, but there is a non-discrimination for gender, for national, minorities and so on, denomination, religion, but there is nothing on sexual orientation. So I think it's not. There is some.
It must be, but if it's defined the way Agnieszka was saying, then it's defined exclusively for Nazi Germany. So then any kind of Polish guilt is absolved.
Well,
we had the same in Romania since 2006 until 2015. And only since 2015 did we introduce a new one, which also includes Romanian crimes. Before it was, like you say, swastikas and Nazi symbols.
Yeah.
But it did not cover Romanian fascist symbols.
Well, and yeah, integrating minority sort of memories. So yeah, what I tried to say is that even the attempts of integrating these stories are not very well done in the end, because if you sort of exoticize the minorities and if you consider them as like sort of the interesting tourist attraction to see a mosque or a synagogue, I mean, this is not really going to achieve the goal. So I think that's it. If I missed any comments,
okay.
I'm sorry.
So, thank you very much. Wonderful session. Okay.
I need to be at the hotel at 4 with my luggage in the taxi.
Okay, so we're starting our actually last session with our keynote speaker, Bogdan Stefanescu. I always put the wrong stress on your first name, I'm sorry, because you've been Polonized.
Colonized.
Colonized, you know, in good cause. And Bogdan is from the University of Bucharest, and I wanted to show you a book because he's the author of one of few monographs on... Is this one? Okay, I don't know this one actually. I don't know this one, not the one that is circulating over there. Few monographs on post-communist, post-colonial convergences and divergences and problems and various common causes, etc. So a very interesting book that is circulating, and I will not make it any longer. Please say what you have to say to us, and then we'll take questions, which can also be, I think, the wrapping up discussion, so to Bogdan and to the whole event. Yeah.
Thank you, Dorota, for the introduction, for having me here, for the honor of being a keynote speaker. Of course, I'm the last keynote speaker, which is no fun.
It's an honor.
You must all be very tired by now. And the previous keynote speakers have raised the bar so high that my talk is doomed to be anticlimactic. So thank you for that, Vyacheslav. It became clear by now, I think, during this conference that the political phenomenon we're dealing with is called by different names. It's new or refurbished nationalism, it's populism, it's xenophobia, it's liberal democracy, it's whatever else. So, after all, what's in a name? Yeah, as Shakespeare put it. Wouldn't the new nationalist smell as rank by any other name? Perhaps, but names are important in the human world. Roses may bud and bloom and die oblivious of their name, but humans are in the habit of killing one another, for a name and in the name of something or somebody. And often it is the name that we see and evaluate rather than the actual person or thing being named. And even more than that, the name maketh the man. The words take on a life of their own. And this is not just poetry or an outdated notion of honor. This is what pragmatic theories of speech acts, for instance, and performativity of language tell us. Or the notion of, you were talking about Lakoff, the metaphors we live by. Or critical discourse analysis, or social and Foucauldian constructivism. So perhaps it would be interesting to look at the name, the history of this coinage, new nationalism, right? We all know it. Perhaps we should have been talking about the new nationalism, or maybe the new nationalists, because there's been a series of new nationalists so far. To distinguish them from Theodore Roosevelt's doctrine of 1910, a socialistic, right? The opponent's name, political philosophy to counterbalance the laissez-faire style in U.S. politics, which meant government regulated or centralized economy, increased federal power, upholding the interest of the underprivileged and the powerless, social justice, roughly a welfare state policy. Remember his words, the executive power as the steward of public welfare. Interestingly, Obama took up the same ideas in 2011, speaking publicly in the very same town, Osawatomie, Kansas, where Roosevelt delivered his new nationalism speech. And this is what Obama had to say. Economic inequality also distorts our democracy. It gives an outsized voice to the few who can afford high-priced lobbyists and unlimited campaign contributions, and runs the risk of selling out the democracy to the highest bidder. And it leaves everyone else rightly suspicious that the system in Washington is rigged against them, that our elected representatives aren't looking out for the interest of most Americans. Isn't that populism? It was called populism. Just like Teddy Roosevelt, politics was called populist. So as you can see, there's an overlap, at least in American politics, there's an overlap between the concepts of nationalism or new nationalism and populism, right? The populism of the People's Party, the Progressive Party, and so on. Not derogatory terms at all. And such political attitudes have a relatively dignified tradition there. Now, let's look at another tradition, the newest tradition, right? People talking about these new nationalisms, the phrase that we are using, right? The new nationalism is picked up from a more recent situation. One possible origin, or one possible simply instance of people using this new nationalism coinage in a new way, is an article, an editorial in The Economist, 2016. Trump's World, the New Nationalism.
We were first.
Yeah, right. When you look at that, you realize that the category is still very troublesome, right? In pairing Trump with other ethnocentric chauvinists on the rise in the world today, Putin, Erdogan, Islamic, Hindu, Chinese nationalisms, the columnist introduces a series of prejudices and cliches, misnomers that usually distract us from understanding the true nature of this new and dangerous political trend. Here's one. Nationalism is chauvinism. And there you have the quotation. Welcome to the new nationalism. For the first time since the Second World War, the great and rising powers are simultaneously enthralled to the various sorts of chauvinism. Right? And then he goes on to recycle another old misconception. That there's a distinction between good or civic nationalism and bad or ethnic one. Right? And you can see the description that he's providing. Civic nationalism is conciliatory, forward-looking, Ethnic nationalism is zero-sum, aggressive, nostalgic, yeah? Draws on race, yeah? What set nations apart, and in its darkest hour in the first half of the 20th century, ethnic nationalism led to war. Now, each of these stereotypes sounds okay to us, actually. But if you combine them, they don't make any sense, as he does in this editorial. If nationalism is chauvinism, and nationalism can be either bad or good, then you have good and bad chauvinism. Where's the logic in that? Here's another prejudice in the article that goes on. Nationalism and the European Union, right, are mutually exclusive. Okay? You have there the quote. The EU project is naturally endangered in the mind of the columnist by Brexit and by the xenophobic ultranationalism of Hungary and Poland. Now, mind you, there is no adjective, there is no qualifier attached to Brexit. But Hungary and Poland are xenophobic ultranationalistic, right? Although Brexit itself was, at home in Britain, cold ultranationalist, accused of blood and bitter reactionary nationalism. Why the difference? The subtle difference in discourse? I think that the explanation is another prejudice. Western nationalism is okay. Eastern European nationalism is reprehensible. And that there's a long scholarly tradition for that idea. Now, why am I calling these prejudices or misnomers? Because by now, they have become part of the conventional wisdom in the public intellectual domain. An unchallenged, and I'm quoting now Anton Levin from King College, London, an unchallenged, vulgar, and didactic form of the constructivist theory of nationalism. Many historians, sociologists, politologists, and even anthropologists have taken such preconceptions as creeds and axioms that need not be subjected to falsifiability tests. And existing logical or empirical counter-arguments from a lot of other scholars are completely disregarded in public discourse. And this happens even in scholarly discourse on nationalism, which has become more and more polemical, verging on ideology and political pamphlet. A number of established scholars have provided logical and empirical arguments against these academic myths. We call them academic myths to refer to uncritical, simplistic, polemical, militant cliches, posing as rigorously tested and consistent academic savvy. So, let's take them again one by one. Yeah, nationalism is chauvinism. There's a number of experts, there's a number of scholars studying nationalism that said nationalism is not mindless, unfettered emotion, but it's a form of collective self-consciousness, self-identification, therefore a form of reflexivity. Okay? And this is proved by a lot of pronouncements, historical pronouncements from the people you see there. Mill, Lord Acton, Renan, Mazzini, right? That nationalism is not necessarily xenophobia and chauvinism, right? Good nationalism versus bad nationalism, right? You have people like Anthony Smith, right? In fact, he says, in fact, every nationalism contains civic and ethnic elements in varying degrees and different forms. Sometimes civic and territorial elements predominate. At other times, it is the ethnic and the vernacular components that are emphasized. And he gives some examples, right? A lot of other people saying the same thing. Important names. Nationalism and the European Union are mutually exclusive, right? You have there examples of scholars proving that that's not the case. And also, to satisfy those who are interested in numbers and polls and statistical evidence, there is at one point, it was a comprehensive survey of public opinion in all applicant states. Yeah? That showed high levels of national pride did not prevent high levels of European pride. Yeah? People are saying that certain European states have seen the EU not as an opponent of their nationalism, but as a new vehicle for them. Nationalism, not necessarily chauvinism, right? But national project. Okay. Western nationalism is okay, Eastern European nationalism is reprehensible. Let's take, for instance, just like Greenfield. He claimed the distinction between Western and Eastern types of nationalism makes little sense geographically. Why? Because, she said, if we assign individual societies to any of these originally geographical categories on the basis of civilizational characteristics, we might have to characterize many Western European societies as Eastern Europe, while most of the West or Europe would paradoxically move to another continent. Obviously the States, yeah, the American continent. Right? And, you know, Stefan Howard talking about how John Stuart Mill actually advocated, yeah, the supporter of civic nationalism, advocated the absorption of inferior cultures into the dominant nationality of a country, and how he mounted on an elaborate defense of British colonialism, as opposed to Bad Herder, right, who objected to the claims of superiority of certain cultures on the grounds that at bottom, all comparison between nations is out of place. Every nation has its center of happiness within itself. So why are we not paying attention to what all these people are saying? Why are we disregarding the host of conceptual and empirical arguments provided by these people? I'm not saying side with them. I'm not saying accept what they have to say. I'm saying simply consider what they have to say. And when you come up with the notion that nationalism is chauvinism, explain why those counter-arguments are not convincing. Why do we keep treating nationalism as chauvinism, a threat to the cosmopolitanism, to the European Union? Why do we use the term to name xenophobes, racists, and anti-liberal demagogues? Well, I have a couple of answers at least that I'm going to suggest, but just for the sake of discussions, one simple answer is for ideological reasons. That is for non- or insufficiently critical reasons. An ideological West-centric bias, which is founded on idyllic, cliched civic national democracies, has been warping scholarly evaluation. German Nazism, Italian fascism, the brutality of Basque and Northern Ireland separatism, these are exceptions, abnormalities in the history of the West. Whereas for Central and East European history, ethno-nationalism is taken to define the very historical nature and development of the region. Another answer, and we've been talking about this with Raoul, is for the sake of expedience. It's easier to accept that that's the case because so many people are saying that, so why contradict, why try to explain stuff? We'll just, you know, go with the flow. I think perhaps we might have been misrepresenting nationalism all this time. Nationalism, I think, is much more complicated, complex, and contradictory. It's a process of consistently constructing a national identity which has very little to do with the simplistic, schematic, derogatory use of the term nationalism that has become so widespread. Perhaps that's why embracing this approach called discursive constructivism that might perhaps offer a new perspective. Now we've seen the importance of discursive constructivism and its models throughout the conference. And it's part of what has been called a cultural or even discursive turn in the social and political sciences. So the reasoning goes something like, if nations are imagined communities, as Benedict Anderson says, that is subjective constructs, imagined, right? Then they are constructed through or as discourse. Therefore, nations are discursive constructs. And there's lots of people saying that, right? Anderson, Hall, Homi Bhabha, Billy, right? banal nationalism, great Calhoun, right? A lot. And especially Ruth Voda, right? The discursive constructivism represented by scholars like Voda is part of a new set of approaches from different disciplinary quarters that draw the image of discourse as what I have called a thought, speech, action continuum. Representations of reality are present to our mind as speech, and they generate rather than simply reflect the reality both to our minds and in the world. In other words, you do things with words, as Austin put it, right? So I'm working along some of the important points made by Ruth Vodak and her co-authors in The Discursive Construction of National Identity, wonderful book. Nations and national identities are discursive constructs. There are several discourses on national identity that interact in the same public space. The national self-images are dynamic results of interactions between these competing versions of the nation. So now let's look at how these words we've been using look like from this perspective: nation, nationalism. Right? A nation is the result of an unstable, multicentric interplay of several national images in the public sphere. What is a national image? A form of collective self-identification that is an encultured discursive representation of one's own putative community whose history and political agenda are conceived as unified and compatible with each other. Such a collective self-image is based on how subjects conceive their relationship with cultural others, various cultural others. Okay, nationalism is the process of consistently and collaboratively reshaping, through reflection, a discursive communal identity, i.e. a national image. And it consists in developing and harmonizing ideologically the historical self-narrative of a group with its political strategy for the future, and also in enculturating that identity through authoritative propagation and reiteration. Okay, so nationalism is, as Professor Erickson puts it in his book on nationalism, a political form of reflection. All right. Now I've devised an analytical grid that I'm using to distinguish between these different nationalisms, working at the same time within the same national public space. You can look at them as stylistic matrices for ideological positions on nationalism as well. This is just for the sake of illustration. I'm not going to go into the details of this analytical grid. What is important for me is to look at the master tropes, a concept I've taken from Hayden White, right? And changed it a bit, played with it a bit, to make it more relevant for the way in which we represent self versus other. Okay? And I've combined that, it was helpful, right, to look at his master tropes by using François Hartog's imagological distinction of how cultural self and cultural other are seen in Herodotus, right? And that is through inversion and analogy. Okay? So the resulting scheme of master tropes is the use of antitheses to represent this relationship, the use of simile, metaphor, and irony. So these are four major ways in which you can represent this relationship between the self and the other. And I had some examples from American, national, traditional U.S. national images, and the recent one as well, to show how this works, how antithesis works. For instance, inversion, typical oppositions by which you define American character by opposing it to something that is the inverse image of Americanism. Yeah, you have some examples there. Mind you, antithesis, right? This looks like antagonism, This doesn't have to be exclusionary. It doesn't have to be chauvinistic in any way. It simply focuses differently on national character. It places a different focus. The focus is explained as the opposite of another national character. And then you have analogical nationalism, the master trope being simile, right? An interesting way in which you focus on similarities, on the common and compatible features of the American self and of any possible cultural other, right? The universals you were talking about earlier on, right? That are being accepted as part of who I am as an American. And the best example, perhaps, is Karl Schurz, right? And he's consistently employing the principle of similarity to invoke a liberal model of true Americanism. Right? The equal treatment of diverse portions of American society. Then you have more difficult tropes like metaphor, symbolic nationalism. They're counterintuitive. You can't use logic. You can't use Aristotle, and his principle of non-contradiction to understand them. But nevertheless, they are used in creating national images, not just in America. I was just giving an example, right? American history, American images. But I've done that in my book. I've done that concentrating on Romanian nationalisms. These several ways of constructing a national image. And I've also sprinkled some examples from other countries and other cultural traditions in the book. So the melting pot, for instance, right? The pluribus unum type of image, right? Or the American nation being epitomized by Freetown meetings, right? Small-scale meetings. And also paradoxical nationalism, right? Which is a shocking identity or mutual dependency of the American self with the cultural other. You employ irony, a paradoxical rhetorical trope, to create a dialectic of opposites where good and evil, victory and defeat are converted into each other. Right? Examples. Remember Martin Luther King Jr. Seeing hope in despair when he said the American people are infected with racism. That is the peril. Paradoxically, they're also infected with democratic ideals. That is the hope. While doing wrong, they have the potential to do right. See the conversion of wrong into right. Right? Doesn't, again, counterintuitive. Doesn't make much sense. But it is a trope being used to construct our national reality. Or the quote, it says, post-human rights America is prone to racial paradoxes such as colorblind racism, right? Or the image of Barack Obama as somewhat of a paradox. Black but white. Manly but feminist. Alien yet familiar. Foreign but quintessentially American. And of course, dubiously Christian. Right? This is a quote from Camille Nelson, The Racial Paradox. Now, what do all these examples show is that I think, on the one hand, they're examples of different templates for nationalistic discourse, right? That counter the myth that nationalism is uniform. It's litany sung in a single voice. There's only one image of the nation. And another thing is that these examples are telling us is that nationalism is not hatred of the stranger or of another nation, of another minority. And therefore, hate mongers like Trump are not really nationalists. Right? When nationalism becomes thoughtless emotion, when it loses its ability to reshape the face of the nation and redefine its identity, nationalism becomes something else. Some people think of this as, bad or extreme or ultra-nationalism is still nationalism, but it's gone crazy, over the top, like a mean or rabid dog, right? Mad, but still a dog, right? Now, I propose a different image. I propose that the so-called extreme nationalism is to nationalism what a zombie is to a human. right? That is, it somehow resembles a human, but it has lost its humanity entirely. Right? Extreme nationalism is zombie nationalism. It's no longer nationalism at all. It's extremist, intolerant, hateful discourse, right? Of the Trumps, the Farages, the Le Pens, the Jobbiks, and whatever. Yeah? It's pseudo-nationalism. Okay, and these politicians we've been talking about, and these parties, and the public discourse of anti-EU, anti-immigrants, anti-elites that they foster are not really nationalism. What are they? They've also been called populists, right? Sometimes, and I have, my own story about that. And in the end, what I say is, and I don't have time for that, is that there's a difference between respectable, legitimate populism that also has a respectable history, right, and pseudo-populism, right? And pseudo-populism is an inherently demagogic political gambit for immediate self-serving aims that uses oversimplified, antagonistic images of the nation to exclude or damage some people in that politics. All sorts of elites, ethnic minorities, immigrants, and so on and so forth. It's discriminatory, chauvinistic, xenophobic, or racist, anti-democratic, illiberal, and even, ultimately, immoral. Right? Now, some of the characteristics of this pseudo-populism, it zombifies both antagonistic nationalism and populism. Yeah? And interestingly, the adversary is free-floating. It can be anybody and anything, right? And they jump from one adversary to the next. My heart goes with you, Vyacheslav.
I'll let you.
Okay, thank you. And also the people, hence the title, partly explained by this. The people is also a free-floating concept. It may be identified in different ways at different times, depending on what is more convenient for that politician. Right? Now, I was going to look at other features. Accelerated and short-range political action is typical of these pseudo-populists. Right? They're not thinking long-term for the benefit of the people. They're thinking quick measures, quick satisfaction. Doesn't matter if then I change my mind and I'll say, no, I never said that, or whatever, yeah? And the other thing is shattered thought, speech, action continuum, right? Inconsistent discourse action, ideologically disjointed, demagoguery, no core principles or values or beliefs, promise anything, offer immediate gratification, then radically change your tune, retract, do countermeasures, lie. I never said that. No, you misunderstood, right? And so on and so forth. Now, I'm reaching the case study part of this. How much do I have? How much more do I have?
How much do you want?
It's bargain.
5 minutes?
Bargaining.
6?
Make it 10. Okay.
No.
All right.
Give you 6 from the beginning. And then
Right. So let's look at the Social Democratic Party, the PSD in Romania, right? Now ruling Romania. This ruling party, has assimilated this pseudo-populist discourse. We don't have an extremist party. We don't have our Jobbik anymore, right? We don't have this kind of thing. And we don't need it because the ruling party has adopted that, yeah, in a very clever, more modest way, but it's still there. So you have the same fixed schema or template, antagonism, right? That's what they do. They set people against one another. And flexible fillers. The people is indefinite. The adversary changes all the time. Foreigners are typically invoked as a ruse for political gain, not cultural self-image. Political gambit, accelerated short-range gratification. They promised huge increases in salary for the last elections. Now it turns out nothing happens. Yeah? On the contrary, some people got lower wages. Doesn't matter, now they're changing their tune. Internally divisive and exclusionary, xenophobic, not least of all, a lack of honor. Shameless, even when convicted. Victor Ponta, the former head of the party, a proven but unrepenting plagiarist and his PhD. The current leader, Liviu Dragnea, is a convicted felon with a suspended 2-year sentence for trying to interfere with a referendum, for Christ's sake. Talking of populism, with a referendum, right? To dismiss the president. And obviously, ideologically, totally disjointed, free-floating demagoguery, inconsistent discourse action, shattered thought, speech, action continuum, right? But also want to look at the counter-discourse. What the people, another the people, yeah? Another the people has mounted as an anti-PSD discourse, right? The difference is that the features of Romania's PSD discourse, in spite of its looseness and disjointed nature, it is very unified, it's monotonal, a single, ready-made, simplistic template for the nation, and that's antithesis. I fight for you, the people, against the enemy. That's the simplest way of putting it, right? The features of the, for instance, the movement known now as the hashtag resist anti-PSD discourse. Multitonal. All nationalistic templates are represented there. Although national images are mostly condensed or only implicit, right? And now let's quickly look at it to see how that works. This is a movement that peaked in February, yeah, against attempts from this government to legalize corruption, basically. So look at the massive turnout, right? Almost, for some people, almost 300,000 participants in Bucharest, 600,000 across the country, largest demonstration since December 1989. It has a nationalist agenda attached to it. Yeah, national flag and anthem, always present there. And they're narrating a new political history of the national community in a different voice, a voice that is more personalized. Yeah? I am doing for my children what my parents could not do for me. So they're creating a history. My family history is the history of the country. Yeah? Is representative for the history of my parents are the parents who did the revolution, you know, contributed to the revolution of 1989. Right? They tried, but they couldn't change the system. We still have these bloody communists, so I'm trying, yeah, in my turn, to do something for my children. I hope I'm doing more than what my parents did. And that creates a historical narrative on it. And you have all the templates that I've been talking about, right? The radical antagonistic national images, the counter-antagonism of the crowd, right? The slogans that they're chanting, right? You can see that they're oppositional. They're imprecations and the sarcasm and the belittling of the powerful, right? Dragnea's mom, can you come out of the house to play with? Because they wouldn't confront the people, right? Okay. And the answer is no, because he steals. The mom supposedly says. And Iordache, who was the Minister of Justice, who was instrumental to the attempt to legalize corruption, was called Ciordache, which is, you've seen the etymology of that. And the puns there using Dragnea's name, right? Dragnea fila pușcărie, or we don't believe you, right? Okay. Another one is, this is Iordache, the Minister of Justice, right? Who famously, in one interview, wouldn't answer any of the questions from the journalists because they were awkward. No, because they were awkward, he had no reply. So he would rapidly say, another question, right? And then someone else would, another question, right? Another question, until he found a question that he could answer, right? Another question, altă întrebare, but întrebare in Romanian also sounds like between bars, like put in between bars. Okay. You also have the liberal, analogical images based on similitude between Romanian national values and European values, right? Civic values. And you can see how they were working a European symbol, yeah, in the crowd. Okay? You have the similarity in chants like, I want a country like the countries abroad. And they're obviously talking about these Eastern, European Union and Western countries. I want to live my childhood in a democracy, and so on and so forth. And Dragna, remember, this is my country too. This is not just a country for one part of the population set against another. This is for all of us. We have to share, right? And so on and so forth. And I think it's interesting, the last one, right? Typically, the PSD voters are older people, right? So one of the protesters was holding out a sign saying, "Yes, Mom, I'm wearing warm clothes," right? Suggesting at least two things. It's ambiguous, right? A willingness to acknowledge these voters, these other Romanians who did not share their opinions, right? And try to mitigate the gap between them in a loving way. But also showing that even these diverse constituencies, young and old, are consensual in their respect of the rule of law, right? So it doesn't matter if they voted for you, they still don't like what you're doing, right? And then the metaphoric or anarchist symbols, right? Using the metaphors to imagine a country. That's an implicit, mostly implicit, less explicit than the other ones. It's implicit because it's the tacit anarchist platform that is apparent in the decentralized, spontaneous, participative, democratic manner of organizing the demonstration, contributing to these demonstrations, mostly through social media. It's kind of an informal referendum. Yeah, just people just showed up in the streets and they generated this informal referendum, and also bringing children as a metaphor. Yeah. Of innocence, of purity, of the future, yeah? Doing politics with, interest in the consequences for my children, for the future generations. And educating them, using education rather than immediate political interest as a symbol, right? And you also have a conservative, a more conservative in the sense of a paradoxical view, an ironic view of the national image. Ironically accepting insults and calumny, and even parading them with pride. Yeah? A public display of alleged secret machinations. Of course, PSD immediately said, this is Soros funding this demonstration, right, against us, because he hates Romania, he wants this to happen. So people in the street went on saying, Soros, if you're seeing this, the money still hasn't reached me. What's going on? You're supposed to pay for this. Where's my money? Right? Or Soros, consider giving me a bonus for difficult working conditions, because this was February, February weather in the winter. Okay? Or converting offensive labels into a proud cognomen, right? They were called hooligans, right? Soros men, Sorosist, right? Better a Sorosist than a communist, or better a hooligan than a liar, and so on and so forth, right? Okay. So what's wrong with? Hopefully now we see that what's wrong with calling people who want to generate a new image for the country, by the same name as people like Trump, Dragna, right, or all of these other politicians we've been talking about. Yeah. What is wrong with that? Well, conflating nationalism and pseudo-nationalism can delegitimize, can ignore national sentiments and interests, and it pauperizes people's collective identity, their sense of solidarity, of belonging, of responsibility, and it pushes them to embrace extremist reactions just because you refuse nationalism, you refuse this as a legitimate activity, as a legitimate state of mind. Using populism as a derogatory label may also discard social justice together with it, and public involvement in political decision-making. It may increase the feeling of powerlessness of the common people. And perhaps we need to recalibrate the balance of elite, representative, democracy and participative democracy. I think we also need to be more tolerant of alternative ways of conceiving the nation that are not necessarily exclusionary. And I have to insist on that. Let's not be contaminated. Let's not contribute to what Dorota was calling the dichotomous, divisive, brutal, new linguistic behavior in your speech at the beginning of the conference, right? Yeah. Perhaps we should complement our more technical concepts with moral tones and stands, right? Perhaps we should introduce, I know Raul has an objection to that, but perhaps we should introduce demagoguery as a relevant concept. Not all politicians are demagogues in the same way. As I was saying, it's one thing to promise 5.6 increase in whatever economic chapter and have instead 4.9, right? Or run into trouble, yeah, because of an international context and not being able to do that, although you're trying desperately to do it, right? That's one thing. But to say, I'm going to increase your wages and then seize power and do the opposite, right? I'm going to do that and not care about that at all. I think that's lying. That's the Mongolian. It's Serbia, right? Okay. And it's shattering the thought, speech, action continuum, right? And we need to take public stand against what we conceive as wrong, irrespective of our ideologies, and lying, corruption, civic issues. We need to reinsert cultural criteria in the study of nationalism. Divergencies, translatability, the speed of social change, all these things are cultural criteria that need to be considered, right? And we need to consider cultural mediation between communal selves and cultural others, because possibly one of the reasons why things are happening is not economic reason, is not social reason, is not, but maybe it is our lack of mediating different communities within the same nation, right? Or within the same political organization like the European Union. Pay more attention to discourse styles, genres, and structures, because discourse is both a form of understanding and a form of social action. And consider, perhaps, the material importance, the concreteness of abstract or imagined communities, right? Professor Kroch was saying, right? The abstract community is different from the concrete community. Imagined communities, that they're concrete, they have a concreteness. For a healthy moral society, you need to understand that material importance of such things. And how do you do it? I think that is a reflex of the level and the quality of humanistic education. That's why I agree with Rob. That only humanistic education provides the platform for understanding cultural identities. Right? The exact sciences are good, computers, yeah, IT sciences are good, but they won't offer you, yeah, as a young and growing conscience, they don't offer you the tools to understand identities and work with them. So that's it. That's my presentation.
Now we'll be taking questions.
Okay.
Or comments, disagreements, challenges.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Expect that.
Antagonisms. Barbara.
I myself think that definition in social sciences is a suicide mission, so I'm impressed with it. So, but that's why I have a question. I never did this. How do you manage to find criteria to distinguish these different notions on the level label of the notion and definition by some features? Because what you define as a real populism are usually defined on the intuitive way, of course, as a socialism.
Right. There are definitely overlaps. Yeah.
Could you explain how you make the systematization of these different notions?
At this point, the only thing you can say, again, populism was something that I incidentally, right?
Touched upon.
Yeah, well, touched upon. My interest is nationalist, but populism, I think you look at first of all, you look at the historical evolution, right? You look at the history of the phenomenon. Yeah, and that brings already an alarm, right? Saying, wait a second, populism is not necessarily what you think populism is, because you're just looking at today and what is happening today.
Of how people use the word?
How people use not just the word, because there's more than a word to populism. It's a political practice.
If I can comment something, it's the historical manifestations of populism that I've identified as such. The first being the Nationalisms.
Sure.
The Germans associated with the Nationalism, they had a left-wing platform. There were intellectuals who were going to villages, trying to improve the situation of the peasantry in Tsarist Russia in the 19th century. There was an American populist party, which was agrarian and actually bottom-up, so based on farmers. They actually were not elites, they were genuine people, grassroots. And it was called as such American Populist Party, again, at the end of the 19th century. So this is where the term started being used. And the literature dealing with contemporary populism completely ignores these two examples. Although, and the third main use, historical use, is for Latin American populism, which brings us closer a bit to the one today, because it was right-wing authoritarian dictatorial, but it was state populism. So it was established after military coup d'etat in various countries in South America. But these are the three historical examples of populism where people either self-identified as populists or had this explicitly in the name of the organization. So this is the historical populism, I think, that you were talking about.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Except that with the Latin American populism, which is invoked by Mude, for instance, good nationalism versus good populism versus bad populism.
Yes.
Right? This is bad populism, and then I need to work with that because it doesn't make logical sense, right? How can you have the same thing? How can you provide a definition for something and say you have the good and the bad, right? You reach the absurd conclusion that you have good chauvinism and bad chauvinism, or the other way around. Yeah.
Okay, now Tamara.
But it is a difficult problem. I recognize that it is a difficult problem. How do you define it? It is suicidal to a certain extent, but just because it's difficult, you have to, doesn't mean you don't have to do it. You have to, because otherwise we're talking about stuff, we think we know what we're talking about stuff, but we're thinking of different things, and then we're providing solutions for them, supposedly, and we realize it doesn't work. Why? Because we're thinking of different things. Or we're conflating different things under one name, or we're using two different names for the same thing, right? And how can you work with that? So you have to try, You fail, someone else comes with a better definition, counter-argument, sure, go ahead, and this is an ongoing process. What else is there to be done? Right?
Tamara?
Thank you very much. It's a great lecture, and it made me reconsider my own work. Well, since submitting the free paper, I already found many things I don't like in my paper, but now I have even more. First, I do consider all the things that you mentioned in the first part of the speech about a need for a more nuanced view of the nationalism. But when I start the second step and go to the analysis of discourse, I'm taking one highly normative view of nationalistic discourse. For me, I can imagine nationalism and analyze it in a very nuanced way. But when I enter the discourse itself, I cannot. Maybe in fact I'm confusing it with chauvinism, but maybe something like that. I cannot imagine a good nationalistic discourse.
Okay, we'll take more questions.
And completely other question. How do you see the emancipatory potential of humor in political action? And do you see the limits? Where do you see the limits? Thank you.
Can I ask a related question to those?
No, another question. You're Dake, right? No, I'm joking.
Don't
right?
quote the wrong persons, you know.
Okay.
Very briefly, it's all very convincing and working and logical and brilliant,
Okay, get to
obviously. And how would I say that? it's a very good work that you're doing, actually intellectual labor, backing up your division, which puts nationalism on the constructive side of political action, in fact, not only discourse but action, and chauvinism on the destructive side. It's very convincing, as I said, and it's, I would even say, visionary. And I might subscribe to a party like this, then I would be a nationalist of the good type, and I would feel good. And the examples of demonstrations were very interesting, because we could say that the same has been happening in Poland in all those anti-law and justice politics against the constitutional tribunal and judiciary, etc. They all obviously contain a strong national core. We're doing it in the name of, you know, the nation that is being endangered by the ruling camp, the whole state, etc. So, and it makes me feel, these demonstrations, very assertive in my identity as a Polish person. Yeah? So makes me a nationalist according to these definitions, and I'm not ashamed of it. But
Okay.
I think you've touched on that. On the one hand, what you're doing is an attempt to construct a visionary program by rearranging the field of definitions, yeah? I could say semiosphere of the word and the discourse around it. And it's not bad, obviously, even though the point is, how about language as behavior in political practice? How do you plan, let's say, if you were to go further with your vision, to, let's say, implement your proposition into real political, public as well, and intellectual discourse, how to make it circulate and how to make people convinced that what happens on the destructive side is not nationalism, but chauvinism, demagoguery, and so on. What if other people will tell you it's a matter of definitions, of how we use words, ignoring maybe some other uses that are actually in practice? And do you want to answer, to take another question?
Let's
maybe,
take another question.
Yeah, okay.
This is going to be long.
Oh
Okay,
my God, no,
stop.
Answer those two
Okay.
first and then you.
You can imagine a good national. All right? What I provided you.
Discourse.
A good nationalist discourse, right, okay. Now, these people that are in the streets, they're providing for you a template for how to construct the nation, reconstruct the nation, because the nation has been damaged by communism, right? It has been damaged by the post-communist governments, right? The predatory elites that took over, right? Corruption and so on and so forth. Now they want to legalize it, right? So they institutionalize corruption, in a way.
Yeah.
Okay. So you want to reconstruct that. How do you do it? You look at these people, they're offering templates, right? They're offering templates.
But it sounds more like a patriotic discourse.
Right, but nationalism is not, okay, you want to be a patriot. You love your country. What is it that you love? How do you know what to love? How can you identify it as your country? Don't you need a national image for that? So that you know what to love?
Or the institutions.
No, not institutions necessarily, but a national image. Yeah? Because even love is a form of discourse. You're putting your emotions, you're putting something you feel inside of you into a discursive frame, right? Okay? So, patriotism for me is not nationalism at all. Because I have examples of nationalism that is not patriotic necessarily. It's not, oh, I love my country. I would die for my country. Not at all, right? On the contrary, you can have nationalist discourse, national images that say my country is rotten, my country is, you know, in shambles. I hate my country. I need to do something about it. Okay? I don't like it. I don't even like it. Not that I don't love it. Yeah? Self-hatred. Yeah? A very crazy form of nationalism, right?
It's called auto-chauvinism in Serbia.
Auto-chauvinism, exactly, yes. Yes, very good name, yeah. Okay? Self-loathing, self-hatred, especially for victimized nations, right? Historically. So there's lots of ways in which you can be nationalist, but not necessarily a patriot, right? And again, not necessarily chauvinistic, right? You're just constructing yourself. Nationalism, constructing a national image is like your collective GPS. It orients you in the world. You have to know where you are, who you are, in relationship to other reference points. Okay? That's what it is. Raul was first.
My question.
Right, okay, your question.
Come on.
She's too close. She's so close.
Wrapping up quickly.
Okay. First of all, and humor, yes. But actually, we don't have. Yes, humor in politics, definitely. Humor. Irony is a form of humor, right? Irony is a form of humor, right? It is. Because it makes you smile at least, right? It's not devastating humor like sarcasm, for instance, right? That's destructive humor. You can destroy someone with humor. But it's clever humor that makes you think that you have an irony, for instance, and putting things in a paradoxical way. Right? Whenever I talk about irony and paradox to my students and provide them with the examples, they laugh, right? Because then when I say, this sentence is false. Well, if it's false, then it's not true that it's false. It's true. And if it's true, then it's false. And then they realize the paradox and they go, ah. And there's a smile on their face because they realize the complications. They understand stuff, right? Okay, so humor, but there's a lot to talk about that.
Yeah.
And to Dorota, I can't answer the question. First of all, because I'm not a visionary. I'm not putting up a visionary program at all. I'm just trying to analyze something. I'm not suggesting a program, right? I'm suggesting that we need. No, I'm suggesting that we take a moral stand together with our scientific approaches, with our academic approaches.
So it's a program, I think.
It is programmatic, but not visionary. I'm not envisaging something, whatever. Secondly, you're asking me how to implement something. I'm just providing you with the analytical tools to analyze something. I don't know how to implement a change in the existence that, it's like asking some inventor, who came up with an invention, but how do you market it? The poor guy doesn't know how to market it, how to implement it in real life. He just thought of it. That's a great idea. I came up with a discovery. I don't know how to use it in business, right? That's someone else doing it. So I need someone else to help with that. I can't tell you. I mean, I could, but who am I? I'm not good at it. So, yes. Yeah.
First of all, I think it's really convincing in acting as a complement to what Miroslav was saying on the first day. I think I see better through your presentation his notion of this new nationalism as being emptied out of the contents that used to be there in the nationalist movement. And I'm convinced by that. I find the metaphor of the zombie excellent.
What about the zombie? I can't hear it.
I find your metaphor of the zombie excellent in terms of nationalism as deprived of this humanistic content that both Miroslav and yourself were speaking about is convincing. But he also mentioned something which I find is important, keeping this in mind, and I'm wondering if you can comment on this. He was mentioning that this happens because this affiliation to the nation is no longer voluntary. That through the nation state and through citizenship, we sort of become attached to the nation whether we like it or not. Whereas this nationalism that he was talking about, the 19th century, 20th century one, which I think is in some ways what, I mean, I know what you're proposing is a new project, but it's trying to recover some of the original juice of the 19th century nationalism and its emancipatory potential. So, what would we have to say about this voluntariness and its possibilities in the context of the nation state? The second part relates to what Dorota said, and I think what you are saying also relates to what Vyacheslav was saying this morning. These projects, piecemeal projects, and you were mentioning it yesterday in a question, in a Q&A, that you can have you were mentioning the examples of the Romanian protests for, I don't know, the collective
civic issues.
Thing, it's various separate issues. And Vyacheslav this morning was also giving us a potential solution addressing piecemeal issues, this road, that kindergarten. How do we make this sustainable? And I mean, you can say it's not, you're not proposing a political project, but you are. So, and I mean, this is a genuine question I have, and I have for Vyacheslav as well. When you try to make it sustainable beyond an action in a certain space on a certain issue, it has to be bound by a certain ideology. And when you try to configure that ideology, you necessarily leave out this anarchic notion of responding piecemeal to things, which is nice and pretty and pragmatic, but it has to be united by something where it cannot be sustained. These protests were fine for a week or two and then they disappear. And they might come again for a different issue. It can be ecological, it can be something else, and they will go again. This is not a movement that will transform Romania, this is not a movement that will change the political system. This will change an issue. And that's it.
Well, it's good if it changes the issue.
Of course it's good, but it's not it's not a challenge to new nationalism. Third, you mentioned alternative ways of conceiving nationalism that are not necessarily exclusionary, and here is where we part ways. Because
wait, say it, please.
As you mentioned, and I quote, alternative ways of conceiving nationalism that are not necessarily exclusionary.
Right. Okay.
And I said that this is where we part ways. I think nationalism has to be exclusionary, because the nation has to have a boundary. That boundary can be many things. It can be extended, it can be permeable, you can let certain groups in, certain groups out, but there has to be a boundary. The definition of, I mean, if it doesn't have a boundary, then we're talking universals, we're not talking nations. Nations have to have a boundary, and that boundary excludes, just as it includes. And that brings me to my other comment, which is again, all this sounds pretty. The constructive and the destructive side to be separated. I think they can be separated analytically. I'm not sure about in practice in politics. Historically speaking, that hasn't happened. You're talking about this effervescence against the corrupt government, and I love it as a Romanian from abroad saying this. But my fascists in the interwar period would do exactly the same at their rallies. They would rally against the government that was objectively corrupt, incompetent, stealing and so on. And they would think they're doing the right thing because they were protesting against the bad thing and they had a feeling of community and they all felt good. And I think that's what I was trying to say in my presentation, that exclusionary nationalist projects have this positive side where they want to see a community emerge. But this has to be predicated on the exclusion of someone or something. And I don't see this going away in practice. I don't see the destructive side going away because we choose to focus on the constructive side. And nationalism, again, historically started with the constructive side. The destructive side came later. And I think, like I was saying to Miroslav's presentation, I think it comes pretty much at the limit when the emancipatory project is complete. When you have included all the in-group in terms of social, gender, other criteria, when your boundaries are as full as they can be, that's when you have to activate the destructive side. That's where you reach the limit of your inclusiveness. Finally, that's conceptual. I really like your scheme of discourse as thought, speech, action, inspired by Vodak and your own take on it. But there's one part missing in it, and there's a Foucaultian, I have to bring it up, power.
Yeah.
These discourses all have power implications. When Mill and Herder are disagreeing, they disagree for good reason. Mill's discourse justifies the British Empire. Herder is a German who is an upcoming power that wants to be acknowledged as an equal to something like the British Empire. So of course, Herder will argue for equal worth, and Mill will argue for inclusion of inferior cultures. Even funnier, I think, is the Marx and Lenin controversy. So Marx wants this inclusive world revolution. He thinks that it's absolutely no problem for inferior cultures to be swallowed up by it. Lenin has a direct interest in decolonization because that would destroy his enemies. So Lenin has this ultimate self-determination, the tiniest region, the tiniest village that wants to be independent can be so. And this is fantastic, but they are political projects. They're not innocent statements, they're not purely analytical statements. They have a concrete content related to power and to their historical implications. That's at least my take on it. Yeah. And
Thank
all
you.
Right. Shall I take on?
So maybe Helge, and we'll end with Bogdan's answers. Make it short.
I'm short. I'm not tall. So, first, I think you can make value judgments without having a national project.
Without having a national
project?
All right.
Yes. You can demonstrate against corruption. I know that corruption is wrong without having a national project.
Sure, yeah.
So, maybe it's a danger when we are discussing new nationalism that everything is related to the nation, to conceive everything related to the nation. So just saying maybe more comment, but maybe something we should reflect on. Then those master tropes. Well, master tropes, it's always difficult to how to organize things in those master tropes. When you say, I think the melting pot is more in melting pots discourse is more in the symbolic. You can also put it in the anti-racism, because we can say, well, we have an ethnic pure nation and those are the native, and this is a melting pot. So how do you take some of these cases? So there's a difficulty. I just wanted to look into that. And another is the process of harmonization, harmonizing.
Yeah.
This is a process, never ends. In fact, there is no end of this process. So, so you always have a group, several groups inside or outside a national territory, and inside or excluded or included. It's inspiring inclusion whatsoever that challenge harmony. So, what to do with this? Is this contradictory to nationalism?
You're talking about harmonizing groups?
Harmonizing
a society?
Right,
okay. I was talking about something else. I was talking about harmonizing your view of the past with your view of the future. That's all. Harmonizing your historical narrative with your political project.
Okay.
Not harmonizing groups. Okay, so, no, my mistake, because I was doing things quickly and too much, too short a time. Yeah. All right, okay. Look, if it's, okay, I'm not going to answer.
No, answer.
Can I answer?
No,
because you're saying it takes too long.
Of course you have to answer.
All right, fine. Let's take it here.
Don't look at my face, I'm just tired, but I'm interested.
I'm just jacked up because I'm here and having to respond. Otherwise, I know. So the melting pot can be interpreted in various ways. Yes, definitely. Okay. So I can put up a trope, an image, yeah, and it's going to be taken up by someone else, and its meaning and its function and how it works in a different context is going to change, obviously, right? But the fact still remains that I said it in a certain context, and it does have in that context a certain, somewhat of a certain meaning and a certain function. And that's what I'm looking at. The change, the dynamics of this change, yes, is very important, absolutely. And that's why I say nationalism is an ongoing project. A nation is an ongoing project. It never is a snapshot at one moment in time. Yes, that. Also, something else. I haven't had time to discuss it, but there's an essential deep structure rhetoric of these master tropes, which means it's how you structure your understanding. You structure your understanding based on antagonisms. And everything is an antagonism, right? Class antagonism, power, everything is an antagonism, right? Or you structure your views based on similitudes, right? So you're looking for similar features, you're looking for categories, you're looking for laws and principles that work universally, and so on and so forth. You structure it using your metaphor, metaphoric imagination, or paradoxical understanding, dialectics, and so on and so forth, right? So these are the deep structure, massive tropes that structure your understanding and the way you perceive how to act. You conceive of how to act. And then there's a superficial rhetoric. Yeah? The ornamental tropes. Yeah? Rhetorical, stylistic devices that make you sound nice, convincing, impressive. Yeah? Moving people, touching people. Yeah? Stuff like that. But that's on a different level. And it doesn't have that structuring power of mass tropes. Right? It's just a coat that you put on. Right? To use an old metaphor. Okay? And you can protest without a national project? Yes, absolutely. Yes, of course. I never said you can't. I was just saying that these people had a project. That they were trying in this spontaneous way to implement the new national project. That's all I was saying. I'm not saying you can't protest without permission. Sure you can.
No.
Back, are you kidding me?
Cutting the question.
I have this load to answer to from Rahul.
I didn't.
Power, yes, of course it's important. Absolutely. I teach cultural studies. How can I ignore power? Yes, of course. But power doesn't necessarily mean you have to be bad using it. Right? You have to be a villain. You have to be an asshole. Right? Or you have to be a pure innocent victim of power. Right? Power can be used or abused. As you know, remember that Schindler's List dialogue between Schindler and the crazy Nazi who was shooting people randomly, and he said, that's not power. Real power is you can shoot them, but you don't. You choose not to. That's real power. Right? So the real power is not to use power randomly or, just for these, because it's a kind of a drug. Power is a drug, ultimately. You get intoxicated with it. Okay. Voluntary affiliation, right? I think that if you're looking at nations and national images the way I'm looking at them, it's not a question of affiliating yourself, that is, swearing allegiance, but you are part of a nation willy-nilly. Why do I say that? It's willy-nilly because, first of all, you're brainwashed into being part of a nation through education from an early age. That's one way of looking at it. The other is, you cannot not be part of a nation. Because in the historical context that we are experiencing, a national belonging, belonging to a nation, is not something abnormal, and it's not something you can choose to do, right? It's the utopian thought to think you can refrain from being part of a nation. I'm not really
if you're
a
minority,
I'm a citizen of the world. I think that's utopia to me.
If you're a minority.
If you have a great passport.
Right. A nation, and that's the other thing. Good. That brings me to another question. Nationalism has to be exclusionary.
Yeah.
Only if we take a nation to be the same thing as a state. Wait a second. With a territory.
No.
With a territory. Because exclusionary, let's define exclusionary. What do we mean by it? Exclusionary can be understood as in a destructive, negative way. Yeah? I want to kick someone out. From where? You kick them out from a territory, right? From a space, right? I want to destroy someone because they're destroying my purity, right? This is something too concrete. We're talking about imagined communities. We're talking about the imagination. And in my imagination, I don't have to do that. Yeah? I can construct my nation without any... I'll give you an example. Blaga. Okay?
Who?
Lucian Blaga, a Romanian poet-philosopher who is one of the pillars of the Romanian national images, right? He created a certain symbolic space for the nation. He was looking at the nation using kind of a Jungian, abysmal imagination, whatever. It sounds...
It's highs and lows.
In the highs and lows, yeah. And it's very harmonious, and it doesn't say anything about, except for these fuckers that we need to kick out of the country, right? It said nothing about the other. It simply disregarded the other, creating this harmonious image that symbolizes what a Romanian is. And that's all. It can be done. It was done.
It's a lyrical project, and he's so much of an exception in the Romanian cultural space. I mean, the exception.
It's not. It's not. It's not.
Name another one.
Vâlsan.
Who?
Vâlsan, George Vâlsan, geographer who in 1918, when the country was reunited, gave the inaugural talk at the university in Cluj. Right? Symbolic space. And he was using a metaphor simply to talk about continuity. Moshi și strămoși. Moshie. And he was playing with these terms, not saying anything about how we had to fight this or that, or how this is the enemy. You can do it. You can actually do it if you look at the history. And I'm providing an example in the book. Right? So I think logically you can conceive of this, and historically there are examples. So I'm not convinced that it has to be exclusionary. It is exclusionary in the sense that I am not thinking about the other. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's all. That's all. But is that something bad? When I create my own individual identity, do I have to consider the other? Do I have to include the other necessarily? I'm just constructing myself. Right?
But you construct your identity.
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Like if there is some...
Your relationship with the other doesn't have to be seen in antagonistic, exclusionary terms. I can introduce the other in the equation, in like Noica was doing, for instance, in Romania.
Sure.
Yeah. See, Noica was a wonderful example. He was talking about well, okay. I understand.
Could carry on this discussion because we would have many more examples,
pro
and many more counter examples.
We'll talk. We'll talk.
Bauman was talking about how Jews became excluded from national communities and so on.
I don't agree.
All right, listen, guys and girls, everyone. So I think this has been a wonderful wrapping up, in fact, discussion for the whole conference.
Also a request for some general remarks.
Unless we have some general remarks from the floor to wrap it up even more, you can also wrap up, Bogdan, if you want. You have the voice.
Not more than 5 minutes. And then we would also like to make an announcement about the publication. We made a commitment, but you're not that populist, so we will stick to the commitment. Something about that. But first...
comments.
Comments, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I just thought...
Maybe you can also introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Tim Krüger. I'm from Wrocław Technical University, and my background is in natural sciences, in physics and mathematics, but I'm doing a lot of mathematical models for social contagion processes, let me say it that way. So that's why my interest also came here to attend this conference. And I just would like to make maybe a personal view of what I was missing in the conference, and what I would like to question people maybe to focus a little bit. The majority of talks I have seen here were barely relying on real data. And that was certainly, with a few exceptions like Pierre Schaefer's today and some others, which I found wonderful. I think it's really easily fall into a trap, because our senses usually overestimate the real size and scale of some changes, especially if the changes make a lot of noise, right, in the public media. And then it's like in the magnifying glass, we see things enormously large, the terrorism debate as well. And theories and concepts are certainly important for structuring your thoughts and gateway to reflect and interpret the data which you eventually have. But if you introduce a new concept, a category, a definition or so in natural sciences, say, you immediately ask yourself how I can measure them. Can I really find indicators at least, which somehow tells me in which situation I am? So, and that was, I was missing here, that when you introduce new concepts, because a lot of concepts you speak about, but also in previous talks, I think it would be maybe good to imagine what set of questions I would have to ask a person to classify him more or less uniquely into my categories, assuming that the person doesn't know anything about my definition, of course. And then you see that some of the things are quite hard actually to estimate. And this is a problem as I consider as a very serious one. And I just mentioned an old saying by Galileo Galilei that science is measuring the measurable and finding measures for the unmeasurable. And I think it's as true 500 years, as it was 500 years ago as it is right now. And I think it's something which one should really keep maybe a little bit in mind when building up a lot of fancy concepts and theories to see really, yeah, can I do it in a quantitative, empirical, scientific way? And this is a challenge, I think. I would like to put into the room and
turning into a real science.
Well,
you can join us and then do it.
Today, the data set, the database is much better than ever before because we have access to huge social data. And I've been on many conferences on what is called now social informatics, where the people actually exactly try to take out from all of the fingerprints you left in the social media information about changes or more complex structures. And I'd just like to see
But in fact, I think we would need to define first what we mean by measure in various sciences, because in the humanities, obviously, the measure could be different. So definitely these questions would be very legitimate to ask. I think some of them have been asked. The data was there in, for example, the shape of textbooks at schools or texts of culture, of various kinds, images and so on. These are our data very often. Not only the data that you can gather from people's utterances, these as well. So I think the data was there all the time hovering and it has been measured, but these, the questions that you posed are very legitimate. You could think about a project.
Case studies in social sciences, right? You analyze deeply all your concepts, a few cases. But to estimate trends in the society, and as we speak about new nationalism, it's certainly regarded as either it's growing, either it's a new threat or something. Single case studies are not enough. You need really the population scale somehow. And that is a difficult task really to manage. And
expensive.
Hannah.
I think that there are. I don't think that it's necessary. I think it's not necessarily the business of people in this room to project. To project things. I think that we sort of have a different agenda, which I think it's that the natural sciences have a very legitimate agenda, and the kinds of research that you mentioned, and but research in the humanities has a different type of agenda, a different way that we define what data is, what research is, what research sets are. Not residing from the objectivity of what that we are also striving for. I think it's about how we define science. It's for us. It's no longer the natural sciences that are setting the trend for how we believe that research should be done. I think those are a little bit two different worlds, but it would be great to bridge them. I mean, it would be great to have you in the next conference to present.
I completely agree with to extend what we're saying. I mean, every science defines a little bit its nothing, but the data are the basis of finally deciding also between concepts and theories. And that is becomes an interdisciplinary task. It's certainly clear, and you have also to look out. I mean, you know the details, and then you can better imagine what proper fashion that takes place. So it's
no, it would make it easier in certain parts of our own humanistic sciences to have, for instance, a database of all nationalist texts, right? In a certain, have them together and digital humanities and stuff like that.
I mean, that would be a big step.
There's a project.
To make it, you know, just like in social science, we bring together all the stuff.
Absolutely,
so that anyone could gain free access to these data.
Sure.
And then you make a leap that's
worthwhile. Or measure the impact.
There are two projects I can recommend just off the top of my head. One is, the abbreviation is ERNI, stands for Encyclopedia of Romantic Nationalism in Europe. It's a huge database of texts, national anthems, songs, poems of 19th century Romantic nationalism, the classic form of nationalism.
19th century?
Extremely important. Extremely important.
Yeah.
If we don't understand 19th century nationalism, we don't understand nationalism.
We need a follow-up.
Okay, then 20th century and potentially 21st century is another one called DIAN, stands for Digital Infrastructure for the Analysis of National Movements in Europe. That's supposed to cover...
Just spell it?
DIAN. It's
okay.
Digital Infrastructure for the Analysis of National Movements in Europe.
Okay.
The network that generated these two projects, we recently put together an application for a European grant called Nationalism in a Digital Age. It deals both with the implications of digital age for nationalism and methodologically with how can we use digital tools to study nationalism. If the grant is successful, it's going to be another database that we use, and and that one is geared towards the present, so it's not a past tense project, but something that we want to do. So this stuff is getting developed, but there is something I would say about this big data. As a historian, I don't trust it. I'm sorry, but the scheme you showed us did not predict the peace victory in 2015. The victory of the Poles, I mean, you were showing us a scheme where nationalism in Poland was declining, and then all of a sudden you have a spike in 2015. Based on my work in the archives, working on the interwar period, the 19th century Romania, in Romania, I predicted when Obama was elected, the next president after Obama will be a fascist. Well, you can believe me or not, I can, I have people who witnessed that and told me afterwards, how the hell did you know? But qualitative methods allow you to have insights that quantitative methods can't give you. And that's a methodological bias. I mean, of course I think my methods are better, and you think yours are better. And we have different types of data. And the cool thing would be actually, yes, like you said, to combine it. And what I'm missing from this point of view is neuroscience. Why is there no neuroscientist ever interested in discussing this? Because there have been advances in neuroscience, and the little I can understand.
But they examine very little chunks of reality. For example, very little utterances, not big structures.
Sure.
Too complicated.
But Trump has a very little brain.
I just made two short comments to what you said.
Yes.
The last one with the neuroscience. I found from 2016 a paper in Nature entitled, which was telling that nationalism and patriotism together is a matter of the distribution of grey matter in your brain. So they wrote an article.
Was it Chomsky, maybe?
I
think I've read, something like this by Chomsky.
Exactly. Seriously. And the first one
I would need to see. No, maybe it was Lakoff. Lakoff talks about it.
Prediction of the elections. For that you need more dynamic things and also to short-term mind changes. But a friend of mine, who is actually sociophysics, Serge Galam, has in summer last year, on the base of the opinion formation model, a mathematical model where you put the data available for the US in, predicted the Trump victory in a quite interesting way. I'm not saying that it's telling all of the story, but he was completely off the statistical prognosis, and finally he was right. And I think it's a nice instant of an interdisciplinary way to approach things. If you really want to see what are microscopic mechanisms, I'm building such type models as well, and usually you face the problem. What happens if three people interact just in a discussion?
Sure.
What's going on, right? How I can measure this? Do I change a little bit? Do I just become in your position because you don't like your face? And if you look for measurements, it's almost empty. Nobody is almost looking precisely at this kind of things.
Okay, I think you conclude this very interesting intervention. Now about the publication, we got a commitment from the European Review. It's the journal of the Academia Europaea. It's published by Cambridge University Press. It's very nice. They could publish a thematic issue which could contain 12 papers. So we would make a selection from all the papers that are offered, including the papers of the keynote speakers. But the problem, so that's very nice that they made that promise. But the problem is that they can only give us space at the end of 2019 or 2020. And I'm afraid that the new nationalism, Cambridge University Press, that the new nationalism will be a bit old then, or our papers will.
No, I mean,
old,
but the optimistic side of it is that we would have time to write our papers, and they would go through the reviewing process, etc., etc. Because obviously, if it's like the end of 2019 for publication, yes, we would need to submit.
It should be ready in
19. The end of 1919, but it's actually normal for journals, I guess, because they're always 2 years. I mean, packed at least 2 years ahead.
Collections. If you start putting together an edited collection for a major publisher, it would take 2 years.
Yeah, sure.
It does. Yes.
So anyway, but what Siegfried wanted to say,
what I wanted to say, or really
him.
wanted to ask, it might be that some of you are in the editorial board of a journal which could also accommodate this topic, some sociological journal, preferably an international journal. The European Review is an international journal, so it's in all the databases, international data, EBSCO, etc. So we would make your research accessible to a large audience if it would be published there. But we could, maybe there's another possibility where they could publish it sooner.
Would nationalities papers be of interest? That's the one editorial board and not part of what I can speak to.
Yeah, there's nations.
You put up a proposal, yeah, because there is a range. I mean, Siegfried was researching and he made a selection, but so if you have suggestions, we're, you know,
so, but nobody
suggestions
is
are
an
welcome.
editorial board with some influence.
I'm an American anthropologist, but that's very specialized. It's a very field. And then I'm on the board of Polish journals and Czech journals, but it's not high profile.
Yeah, local journals.
Yeah.
European Review is nice. I mean, it has its limits, 5,000 words, as few footnotes as possible. So for us in the humanities, we tend to write from 7,000 up to 10, and there is not enough space anyway. It's not enough. It's like half of your article. But they have committed themselves. But we can look elsewhere, obviously. And obviously, everything would go through the reviewing process anyway. So, but it's obvious. It's peer-reviewed and so on. But it's a nice journal, published by a respectable publisher, I think. And it's got a reasonable score of points for those countries which have points. It's got good points, and so on.
Anyway, we will send an invitation to all of you, also specifying what we expect, and maybe think of an article of 5,000 words. That's what European Review. 5,000, yeah, 5,000 words, including everything, references, and footnotes.
They like to keep footnotes to the minimum. No footnotes.
But we can send a specification.
You know something.
Text reference, right?
Text reference.
Yes, yes, yes.
No, not MLA. But they have a style sheet. Who said?
House style.
They
Anything else about publication?
There are 2 Serbian papers which are indexed at several databases, but some of them are applying for being included into Thomson Reuters, but I think we should aim higher than that. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So we can do that.
We'll make inquiries on the way anyway.
It's possible anyway.
But anyway, when we send an invitation for you to send the abstracts, we'll try to address other publishers maybe, but obviously we need then to have a body of, you know, to construct the proposal anyway. So it'll be like...
When will be the deadline?
You don't know yet.
I think for the European review it might be the end of next year. So you'd have a year, almost more than a year. What do you think?
But only things that, I mean, it's not that much because we need to have the abstracts and then the papers and then proofreading, editing, revising. Yeah. So this date does not seem to be that far away.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh yeah, explain the picture.
No, you should explain. But I can
no,
explain.
You found it.
The picture.
Yes.
It's an American battleship. But it was Dorota's idea, or your sister's idea.
Yeah, I have a very poor visual imagination. I might say I have no vision, and so I asked my sister, who's quite an artist and photographer, and she was sending us within like 2 days about 36 possible pictures from various areas on the internet and Iran and so on. And we decided on a destroyer. At first it was a Russian destroyer from World War II.
No.
Modern. Sorry about this. Modern. But then we thought maybe if we put up a Russian destroyer, you know, it'd be controversial, as if, you know, the Russians had... We wanted to underline the combative side of some new discourses that might be called nationalism or, for example, chauvinism or pseudo-nationalism or whatever we call it. But anyway, this is our provisional name. And the image of it. And there was some discussion about this image, whether it's viable or not. We had other ideas, but it would be too long a story to tell. So anyway, I mean, so do you think it's totally arbitrary? Because we thought it's just very symbolic.
It's emblematic.
It's great.
Thank you. The right feedback.
All throughout the conference, I thought it was very symbolic. What exactly? But
that's how symbol functions. Actually, symbol never gives you, you know, the exact meaning, right? The symbolism has to be open.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay.
If it's closed, it's allegory.
Close the meeting. Thank you very much for being here, and we see each other again tonight for our last supper. Not very last.
Great, thanks.
6 o'clock.
Here downstairs. Your book.
My book, yes.
Bogdan, put your hand